Having trained originally as an English teacher, I do like words and the use of language. And as I was preparing for this talk, there was one quote that kept coming to me, and I hope my fellow speakers will forgive me, but the quote is from Corinthians, and it talks how God chooses the foolish to teach or to shame the wise, choosing things powerless to shame those who are powerful. Our recovery work, when Mike and I were working in the early 90s, our work was deemed as foolish. And ironically, many of the people telling us then that you cannot recover from mental illness and from severe and enduring mental illness, ironically, a lot of those people are now in positions of academic power or gurus within the recovery movement. And similarly today, our work on thriving gets a lot of resistance from some quarters, even hostility to the idea that people can reclaim their lives and truly thrive. But we say if you always do, I'm sure you know the quote, if you always do what you always did, then you'll always get what you always got. Our intention is to move people from being maintained or stuck in illness through recovery and beyond to a place where they can be happy and thrive. And we do this by regarding distress, not illness, distress, the experience that Laura referred to, on a continuum. And what we try to do is help to normalise the unusual experiences that people use to cope. Just a few more quotes to set the scene. The normal is that which nobody quite is. If you listen to seemingly dull people very closely, you'll see they're all mad in different and interesting ways and are merely struggling to hide it. And my favourite is the next one. Does anybody know what that means? Italian. Da vicino, nessuno è normale. It actually means up close, nothing's normal. Psychiatry and its assertion that mental illness exists, that it can be diagnosed and treated by medication, is perceived by many in our Western society as the prevailing view. It's accepted as the conventional knowledge, isn't it? Based on a medical model which has acquired power. But the unconventional wisdom challenges this dominant theory. It opens its mind to four main ways of knowing: that of culture, emotion, reason, and perception. And if we take just one of those aspects, that of culture, we see immediately how the theory of biochemical imbalance falters. Voice hearers, have we got any voice hearers that will admit to it? Voice hearers and people experiencing psychosis in the West are generally perceived by society, our society, to be ill, aren't they? Schizophrenia, to have symptoms of what we've come to call schizophrenia. And yet in other parts of the world, other communities or cultures, such as shamanism, they're actually simply experiencing something otherworldly, unusual, different. In Africa, hearing voices is seen in relation to a special gift even. In our Western culture, it's seen as in relation to a mental disease. We know that learning to cope with the voices is easier when it's embedded in a social or spiritually accepted belief system, and yet we still continue to label voices and psychosis as illness rather than seek meaning in the experience, is what we attempt to do with Thrive. Self-harm, and particularly self-injury in the West, I think has become a fast track for many people to acquire the label of borderline personality disorder. And yet again, statistically, we know that the majority of people attracting this label have themselves been the victims of trauma, quite often sexual abuse, rape in childhood or adolescence, or some other trauma. The Thrive approach to mental wellness, the first book, the blue manual that some of you have looked at the back, was written by myself and Mike, who you'll hear from later, as a response to the prevailing medical view of these experiences as illness. We find it more useful to view them as mental distress, and taking those four areas of knowing, culture, emotion, reason and perception, we offer alternative explanations and assistance. And that this process of how people descend into breakdown, the first part, then start to learn to break through, the second part, and eventually, the last column, to recognise ways to break out of this hopeless place where they may find themselves, is one that has been derived through our own experiences, our own observations, but one that we've learned through working with many people over the years. And they're all saying much the same thing. This process is fairly universal, we've found. Similar to grief, it can be unique, obviously, and individual to the person, but it does tend to follow a similar path, with similar requirements for furthering the journey and moving on. And I'm going to keep coming back to the process periodically. There's not enough time this morning, unfortunately, to go into the finer details of each stage. And I guess most people here will be quite familiar with the first two stages, the breakdown and the starting to break through. So I'm hoping to devote slightly more time to the last one, Breakout, which is the more challenging, I guess, and least supported by traditional services. And I've got some slides. I'd also like to highlight some of the alternative services that Mike and I have set up and developed over the years. And it just reflects how differently we can provide help and support to people experiencing distress. Thrive is an acronym encompassing some of the main key elements of recovery, that of time, healing, resilience, interdependence. Note it's not independence. Interdependence is taking from but giving back as well, a two-way process. Vivacity and emancipation. And the last is very often challenging to clients, workers and families and friends. We work a lot in America, and I'm sad to say they run Thrive courses because they can't get their heads around the E, the emancipation. They're quite happy to take the time, the healing, etc., but not the actual getting people out of services. That's a step too far. And the concept of Thrive is a very simple one. It's not that clever. It is actually a very basic premise of taking the key elements of restoration and recovery and using them as stepping stones and finding and achieving the future that you want. It's hard work, it's time consuming, and it's frequently painful, both for the person and for the worker or the helper. But the alternative, we think, is to remain stuck, just going round in a cycle. Hope for the pills to work eventually, or wait for a coming wonder. And that doesn't seem to work. You may remember a few months ago, don't know if you got it on the news here, but the television presenter Gail Porter was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And her experiences on the ward reflect my own and many other people that I've met over the years. She says, suddenly I was put in a ward behind the Royal Free Hospital and I wasn't allowed out. It was illegal for me to leave. They put me on all these drugs that I'd never taken in my life. There was no treatment programme, nothing to do. It seemed that the nurses didn't really know what to do with us, so it was easier to give us lots of drugs so we were calm and quiet. In 3 weeks, I saw 3 doctors for 10 minutes each. Each time, all I was asked was, how are you feeling? I told them I felt depressed, they wrote it down, and a week later, another one came back. It meant patients just focused on their problems instead of getting better. I was on something for anxiety, and I wasn't even anxious. I just wanted to go home. That's how I was. I wanted to be back with my son. My ex-husband, this is still Gail Porter, my ex-husband came to visit me and said recently, you got madder every day you were in there. You were dosed up to your eyes with nothing to do. But she does go on to say, encouragingly, that the nurses and support workers, they were fantastic, but it's just the whole system. They don't know what to do with you. Leaving people alone doesn't help. What else can be done? My experience is that most workers desperately want to help. They do want to give their assistance, but they're actually fear of opening up a can of worms can stop them, making it worse for their clients. Sometimes they're very fearful of getting it wrong. This process, the breakdown process, hopefully will assist workers and individuals themselves by having a rough guide to follow and to have tools they can use at different stages, as well as an awareness of where people have been and perhaps where they're moving on to next, and then you can prepare for it. If we look at the first bit then, the breakdown phase, we see that using the Thrive approach, we acknowledge that people have a reason to become distressed. And by this we mean that something adverse happens to a person which affects them negatively, either immediately or more usually over a long period of time, as with myself, leading to breakdown. Maybe they experience a series of difficulties within their particular societal framework. They don't fit in. Maybe they can't overcome things emotionally. And this results in emotional collapse, breakdown. The toxic factors, startling or toxic factors around the person can then inhibit recovery. Factors such as not being believed about abuse or trauma, dysfunctional relationships, poverty, unsafe housing, etc. And it can lead them into a state of absolute overwhelm. And I guess that this is very often, and this is usually when services intervene. Usually when we're actually overwhelmed, that's when services do step in. It's often the straw that breaks the camel's back scenario, isn't it? That things just get too much for people. And I guess at this point, the person is just so grateful in receiving help that they may break down completely, which again is what I did. They just let go with relief. Somebody will listen now. Somebody will help. And with the right support and with time and healing, they can eventually get safe again. But it's at this point that medication can serve a very useful purpose. It can help people to get safe again. But unless we do something more meaningful and exploratory with the person, getting themselves safe may actually prevent further work on self, and it can keep people stuck. And these are often the people who become the revolving door patients. Essential for moving beyond this stuck phase is a period of engaging with the experiences, identifying the real problems and naming or acknowledging them. Self-harm is not the problem. I know this is quite controversial, it's not the problem. Voices are not the problem. Depression is not the problem. These are all messages. These are all the strategies for coping. But the legacy of the original problem is what needs to be resolved, whatever the problem is. How people have come to feel about themselves, about others, their place in society, or lack of it usually. Why they utilise the coping strategies that they do. Why do they do that thing? One very effective solution, which Mike and a few others introduced into Birmingham in 1996, and where in its latter years I was manager, was Anakara. Originally Scalagrigg, Anakara and Celine were the crisis houses which were an alternative to hospital based on Lauren Mosher's Soteria work. And guests were supported emotionally and practically by guides, all people who themselves had a lived experience of distress and were able to be there with them on their journey towards recovery. Activities and groups were available to those who wanted to join in, as was quiet time and ordinary day-to-day things, music, TV, shopping, cooking, games, whatever people wanted to do. But the main difference was the interaction between guides and guests, where dedicated time was allotted for intense work on issues such as voice hearing, self-harm, depression, etc., and also on exploring the original trauma, if there was one, and its legacy, or the problems and its legacy. Having someone who saw beyond illness and honoured the legacy of the trauma produced excellent results. And Anakara was hailed as a huge success with international acclaim until funding was whipped away by the local mental health trust in their conventional wisdom. And the two houses, let's say one was women only, Celine, both were closed and most of the staff had to be made redundant, sadly. Another project which arose from Anakara, however, managed to survive a few extra years, Changing Futures. A small group of us used our lived experience of mental distress and recovery to spread recovery knowledge, person-centred approaches and values-based practice to a range of mental health organisations across England. And we did that through training, consultancy and development work. And this brought money into Changing Futures to top up a small grant that we received from the Department of Health, and enabled us to support many of the former guests of Anakara. And we put on key events to celebrate recovery, including various sessions of Room 101, art exhibitions, monthly symposiums, spirituality workshops, parties, you name it, in addition to offering one-to-one support to individuals and self-help groups. But once again, the funding came to an end. So to return to the breakthrough, the middle section, Self-help groups are incredibly important at this breakthrough stage because although many people may be engaging with groups, it's actually vital to access a wider information, not just medical propaganda, the wider field of knowledge. And this sets the person on their journey of understanding and really helping to make sense of the experience. And it helps to build resilience and learn to avoid future breakdown. We've found that once often people see that they can make choices and they begin to recognise their own power, there's usually feelings of anger, residual anger, either that they've lost many years to the system or lost opportunities to the so-called mental illness and to psychiatry. And it's possible to either get stuck within that anger and maintained in that negative cycle, or with support to transform the anger into energy and positivity and move beyond that to the next stage, the breakout stage. And that's why Mike and I set up the international organisation Elemental, a safe place for people, clients, workers, and family members or friends, anyone, it's not just the service users, it's for anyone, who's rejected the medical interpretation of distress and who seeks to actively work in the field, helping others, running groups, campaigning, writing, speaking at conferences, doing something, that interdependence thing, putting something back in and helping other people. And as you'll see, our groups are in many, many countries. We know that being active helps people learn interdependence, becoming givers as well as receivers. When you put something back in, it's very therapeutic. It's a survivor mission, if you like. Our flyers, I don't know if any of you have seen the flyers, but the next slide shows how we advertise. Do you firmly believe that you have a severe and enduring mental illness which needs treating with medical drugs? If so, this is probably not the group for you. Don't bother coming, please, because what we want is to introduce people like-minded who say, we're experiencing distress, people that want alternative ways to health and well-being. And if so, we really wish to meet you and offer support. We're a voluntary organisation. We've had to find creative ways to work to spread our message. We meet in public places, churches, libraries, pubs, cafes, anywhere that's free. And our members gain confidence through other people's acceptance of their own interpretations that break down. We don't expect it to be challenged by a medical model because it's not a medical model. It helps them to make sense and break through the system, but most importantly, it enables support for breaking free of it. How does it help? Well, we've seen how most of our members with Elemental were either ignored, ridiculed, dismissed, or perpetually challenged by their peers who have not worked through the process, and by some workers who didn't engage with their thinking. Recovery, and in particular thriving, can be quite challenging to peers who are not in the same place, and very threatening to workers who believe in an illness entity. We know that. And our view is that there are hundreds of centres, hundreds of opportunities, groups and services for those who adhere to a medical model and accept this is as good as it gets. There are very few opportunities open for anyone who challenges this perceived wisdom and strives to change their fate and wants to make links with similar like-minded people. Emancipating oneself by definition is a political act, and it requires courage. Confronting power, other and your own, and challenging traditional psychiatric orthodoxy is an essential part of moving towards emancipation. We know it's not easy to do. And there are many key differences between recovery and thriving that we've highlighted on our website, but the fundamental issue is in one's core beliefs. Recovery is seen as recovery from a medical condition or a social problem of your consequence. The politics are often denied or trivialised by some workers and carers. The recoverer themselves at this stage often has little or no knowledge of the politics of madness or the historical perspective of psychiatry. Read your history and see where it's come from. And often accepts maintenance rather than true recovery as the goal. And we see this frequently when people talk of living with the illness, living well with or in spite of their symptoms, or they take on their diagnosis as part of their psyche. And this gentleman was quite correct in his assertion that it probably will change. We've seen in America where schizophrenia has been eradicated miraculously, simply because psychiatrists don't diagnose it anymore. They diagnose something else. Thriving, however, is a political act. The person who is thriving has often begun to develop knowledge around the politics of madness and the psychiatric history. And there's a desire for that political act of thriving to be recognised. The person's experiences and the process of recovery and thriving are seen and understood in a socially political context. And I think Mike will pick up on this later. We often hear women, for example, who have been subjected to sexual abuse or violence, speak out against the pejorative labels of borderline personality disorder that they attract from psychiatry. And they'll say, it's not me who's sick, it's the abuser. That's the real sickness. So reconnecting to life, to healthy relationships, and reclaiming personal power assists the individual to move forward. Taking ownership of the experience and learning from it enables the person to change the relationship from being a victim to being in control, and thus to emancipate oneself. To support the breakout part of the journey and to enable people to reclaim power and ownership, most of Elemental's activities are of a social nature. We talk about our experiences, but actually we just meet together and have fun a lot of the time. And say it's a variety of workers, people in or who have been in the system, carers, friends, anyone that wants to come along, to be honest, that has the core values. And earlier this year, Mike and I decided to rent a crisis boat, our floating support. Hambakale, which means in South African, go well. And I'd like to think that people do. We've got people from elemental groups and colleagues from all over the UK have come together to spend time debating, planning events, but most importantly to have fun, vivacity. Spending time together, healing, becoming resilient, helping each other with tasks on the boat, doing the locks. There's interdependence for you, if anybody's been on a canal boat. Going for pub lunches and chatting over a beer, vivacity. Being inspired, there's some of our members, being inspired by others who have broken free of medication, of symptom management, who have emancipated themselves by rejecting the labels and confronting their own power. And where to next? Our colleague Paula, lead member for Elemental in Wales, who sadly can't be here today, has opened her own Soteria house not too far from here. The sanctuary is a place of healing, safety and thriving, where people will be assisted to truly emancipate themselves. But I just want to leave you with one last quote, as I do like words, and it's by the French author Sidonie Gabrielle Colette. Be happy, it's one way of being wise.